Bright lights, big city. This has been announced as a conversation, and Charlie and I usually talk in Dutch. We decided against that for obvious reasons.
Kunnen we het wel doen?
We kunnen dat wel doen. Er zitten ook wel wat Nederlanders in de zaal. But I think it's more polite to stick to English here. We can talk about these documents and go back and forth, and we'll do that, but there may be burning questions. And if there are, then you'll sort of have to make that clear to me. I see a question over there, yes. Did the Dutch intermarry when they were here?
Yes, they did. Well, intermarry, they did fraternize with the local population, if you want to call it that. We know of several cases in the Beverwijk or Albany area. Arndt van Curler was living with a Indian woman, probably about the time that Jogues was put up in his lawsuits.
Already that early? That's 1640s. Already.
And it's interesting because many of these relationships developed bilinguals, and they become translators later. And the Van Slyke family, for example, were very heavily integrated with the Indian population, and many of the translators in the Mohawk Valley between the Dutch and the Indians come out of that family.
Yeah. So there was intermarriage, and there are examples, but I think in general it was limited, and also it was frowned upon by authorities in the Netherlands, especially the ecclesiastical authorities, but also in New Netherlands. We have one case from the 1640s where somebody is called an unreliable witness because he had fraternized with Indians. So it's a loss of sexual honor, and hence you become, within the honor system of the 17th century, you become unreliable. So while it happened, it was rare and not generally accepted.
And you had to have credentials of belonging to the Reformed Church. You had to be able to post banns 3 times in church. It was a very official procedure getting married.
Yeah.
So if the black or the Indian wasn't a member of the church, then you were outside of wedlock.
And whenever we call these unions marriage, we are of course using a European word on it. We must remember that people like Arend van Curler kept on living in the Dutch communities. His wife and their children lived in the Indian community. So, but Arend van Curler traveled around a bit, so that probably he had a wife in the Dutch village as well. There's a question in the back there.
Was there any obvious reason why they would deny the application?
The 1616 application is interesting in itself. The New Netherland Company had received a monopoly for a certain area above the 44th latitude, I think it was. So that covered the New York City, but it didn't cover the Delaware. So they needed an extension for that. So that's why they applied in 1616. We don't really know. The monopoly of the New Netherland Company expired. Was only granted for 3 years and 4 voyages or something like that. It expired in 1617, and even though they tried to renew it, they didn't get permission. It may be that the States General were already thinking about a new company that would encompass the entire Atlantic world, which later turned out to be the West India Company. That's one possibility. Another possibility is, and we see evidence of that a couple of decades later, that not everybody liked monopolies. Free trade was sometimes preferred. but it depends on the time, and it depends on who was the more powerful political group, faction at the time. We can't use the word party for these decades, but so whenever something is refused, we don't get the reasons. What we find in the sources for the Netherlands is sometimes that requests are refused for pregnant reasons, as they are called, which pretty much means that those in charge didn't want to give the motivation. They were not required to. We think of government as being accountable to the people, but that's not the case in the 17th century. Government, the power to govern derived from God, and you were answerable, you had to answer to God alone for what you did, not to the people. Does that answer your question?
One of the pregnant reasons may have been that the West India Company was being discussed at this time, and that it was actually formed the next year. It may have complicated matters about licensing individual traders at that time to come over, cartels to come over where they were looking for a monopoly that would cover the entire territory. In fact, from Africa to the outreaches of the Indonesian archipelago, that becomes the West India Company, a massive area of the world.
Yes, that's right. Question over here. Yes. Okay.
Next is the island of St. Eustatius, the Dutch island, Caribbean, which of course became a major trading center in the 1700s. My question is, in the 1600s, I know Stuyvesant had connections to St. Martin nearby, but were there transactions between New Netherlands or Amsterdam and St. Eustatius? Is there anything on record?
Not as much with St. Eustatius that early. I'd have to check when Eustatius was conquered by the Dutch, and I would expect it to be late 1640s. There were later contacts, of course. One of the sons of Stuyvesant after 1664 went first to Curacao and later to St. Eustatius. So there are later connections, but some of these Caribbean islands really weren't very useful at the time until they were found to be, especially up there with St. Kitts and Nevis and those islands, were found to be good areas for growing sugarcane. But it's actually a bit later. In the 1640s we don't have that. Interesting thing is, of course, that Stuyvesant is appointed as Director General not just of New Netherlands, but we tend to think of him that way. He also was in charge of Curacao, Bonaire, Aruba and other islands. So he had quite an area under control. He only visited there once in 1655 and only got back just in time to attack the Swedes on the Delaware. He was held up on Barbados, of course, because the English were attacking Cromwell with his western design, was attacking Jamaica, or one of those.
Hispaniola,
was,
and they got beaten up very badly, and Hispaniola went on and took Jamaica instead. It's a very interesting story. This is William Penn's father, Admiral Penn, who surprises Stuyvesant at Barbados. And Barbados is an interesting point. The British move in there without any contest whatsoever. Nobody had ever bothered to occupy the island for some reason. It wasn't considered part of the Caribbean islands. It sort of sits out in the Atlantic a little bit and didn't draw much attention, but it becomes very important later on. And as far as St. Eustatius goes, it's overshadowed by St. Martin, of course. St. Martin is called the island in the corner of the Caribbean, if you can picture a corner to the Caribbean islands. All ships, all Spanish ships leaving New Spain or South America had to pass by St. Martin. So if you held St. Martin, you had a good eye on the trade routes and the silver fleets and so forth. So it was very important.